Welcome to the New Reformed Irenics podcast, the show where we strive to advance Protestant retrieval, theology, and ministry in the contemporary age by having conversations with the next generation of classical Protestant scholars coming out of Davenant Hall and those scholars who are forming them. I'm your host, Jonathan McKenzie. I'm a young classical Protestant currently studying at Davenant Hall, where I'm working toward a master's in letters in classical Protestantism. On top of that, I serve as the groundskeeper of the Davenant Institute's beautiful campus in the foothills of the Blue Ridge in Landrum, South Carolina. But more importantly, I'm a husband to my lovely wife Bethany and a churchman who is a member in the Presbyterian Church in America. But that's enough about me. You'll hear more tidbits here and there throughout these upcoming episodes about my story and how I got involved in classical Protestant retrieval and the Davenant Institute. What's in a name? Well, a lot actually. The name of this podcast in particular tells a story of sorts. Anytime you put the word new in front of something, it implies that there was an old version of that thing. This holds true for this podcast. We call ourselves the New Reformed Irenics because there was an old Reformed Irenics. Today we welcome on the show Dr. Brad Littlejohn to discuss the history and the ethos of a group forged back in the early days of the internet. Well, the mid-2000s, which feels pretty early to my generation, who sought to cultivate Irenicism while pursuing the advancement and retrieval of the riches of the Protestant tradition. Well, welcome to the New Reformed Irenics podcast. Today I'm joined by the president of the Davenant Institute, my boss, my neighbor, and my friend, Brad Littlejohn. How's it going, Brad?
Going great. Great to be on here with you.
Yeah. So could you introduce yourself for the audience? I'm guessing if they're listening to this podcast, they're probably a little bit already in the Davenant orbit, know some things about you. But for those that are new.
Yeah. What's there to say? Founder of this operation back in 2013. We're going to talk a little bit about that prehistory and early history today. And fellow of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Scholar of all things Richard Hooker. And born and bred and prodigal returned South Carolinian. So
Absolutely. And you even dressed for the South Carolinian vibe today with the lumberjack-ish shirt, you know.
I got a lot of wood splitting planned today.
You ready to go? Yeah. So, this is the New Reformed Irenics podcast, which implies that at some point there was an old Reformed Irenics, but not a podcast. It was an email group, from what I hear. So could you maybe give us a little bit of the history of the original Reformed Irenics group that kind of led to the development of the Davenant Institute?
Yeah, so as I say in my reflection I recently wrote on 10 years of Davenant, the Davenant Institute started with someone being wrong on the internet, and that someone was me. So, and that's originally the Reformed Irenics group started that way. Well, actually, I should go back a little before me to, there was I think probably, my sense is like 2007 or 8, there was a friendship sprung up between Stephen Wedgeworth, who was a Reformed pastor. I guess at that time he was probably still a seminary student, RTS, thinking. Friendship between him and a mysterious polymath from Berkeley, California, named Peter Escalante. And together they prowled the internet, as it were, looking for promising interlocutors, looking for young men who were really searching after truth and who were not just grandstanding and showing off their knowledge, which is the vast majority of the Reformed blogosphere and Facebook comment threads during that time. This was, of course, before Twitter, or certainly before X, I should say. So they would engage in. They'd find where interesting conversations were going on among in broadly Reformed theology and engage those conversations and see who really knew what they were talking about, which was very unusual, and who didn't necessarily know what they were talking about, was at least still teachable, which was fairly unusual, but occasional. And then they would kind of reach out to those people in direct messages and get a conversation going and try to build a friendship. So this had been starting to happen for a year or two, as I understand. And then I sort of stumbled into that, I think, by commenting on Stephen Wedgeworth's blog when he was reviewing David Van Drunen's book, Natural Law in the Two Kingdoms. I'd been commissioned to do my first book review. And of course, this was my first book review. I was sort of massively overdid it. Right? It was supposed to be like a 1,200, 1,500 word book review, and I eventually got it down to that, but only after I had blogged my way through the entire book. Like 15,000 words at least, and many, not counting all the back and forth and comments threads. So anyway, I was going through Van Drinen's book, and I knew I didn't like it, but I didn't quite understand exactly what was wrong with it. Because I didn't have a clear grasp of Reformation theology myself, really, at that point. So I ended up going back and forth with Stephen on his blog, and then he was getting in the comments on my blog, and then this guy, Peter Escalante, showed up and started taking me to task. And, I was arguing, pushing back pretty forcefully, as I usually did, and I was used to winning such arguments, but then I soon realized I was losing this argument. This guy knew way more than I did, and it was kind of intimidating, but kind of intriguing. So I kind of kept up the conversation, and I guess we started, direct messaging. And at that time, there were several other guys who got involved in that whole back and forth. Joe Minnick was one, Andrew Fulford was another. I think there were a number of others, and Peter and Stephen ended up going ahead and organizing an email list at that time to kind of build conversation among them.
And could you actually explain a little bit about what an email list is? Because I don't think anybody in my Gen Z generation has ever used an email list. Is that like the old equivalent to a Discord server? I mean...
Yeah, I guess so. Wow, that's funny. Didn't think about that. Yeah, so Google Groups is the main form. I'm sure there were other variants before that. But in theory, you can use it a bit more like a forum. You can just go, you can still do it, go to Google Groups and post responses there without having it show up in your inbox. But in theory, every response can show up as an email, or you can say, just give me, at the end of the day, give me a digest of all the messages that day, or at the end of the week, a digest of all the messages that week. Of course, RI in its heyday was pumping out at least 100 emails a day. So, you had to figure out how to manage it. And I was from the beginning kind of overwhelmed by the volume, or not from the beginning, but pretty, within a couple years in, overwhelmed by the volume of correspondence. It was not a particularly active poster. Some people seem to be on there all the time. But yeah, anyway, it was just, you didn't have to worry about, reply versus reply all. You just replied to the group, and all the emails went to everybody, but you could determine how, as I said, if they all showed up in your inbox or not. But so yeah, it was like I guess it was like a Discord thing. Although of course there's no word limit, so Alistair would write book length emails.
Yes.
So this group started, and I'm told in the early days of the group they were all kind of just talking about how wrong I was. I've never gone back. My I didn't think it would be good for my ego to go back and look at those emails. But a few months in, Steve actually reached out to me and sort of invited me to join. Although he didn't say so in so many words, it was kind of this weird, grandiose. It was like we have this project. We're doing this great thing, save Christendom, blah blah blah. Do you want to be part of it? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't even know if I like you.
Yeah.
So, but I was still going back and forth with Peter Escalante at that time, and then, anyway, long story short, as a result of some of those interactions, and then reading Richard Hooker, I really had this kind of like epiphany moment where all of a sudden all these things I've been wrestling with in terms of two kingdoms and natural law and the relationship of church authority and civil authority and even justification, sanctification, all the Reformation debates kind of clicked in my head, and I sort of understood how it all worked. And my dissertation came out of that. And shortly after that, I did join the email list, and it just became a intellectual home for me and a place to form really deep friendships that I didn't really have in my grad school environment, where everybody was just kind of doing their own projects and often, so specialized that it was difficult to even have a conversation, but also often kind of cagey and protective of the work they were doing, whereas the RI ethos was all about creating a shared pool of knowledge where everybody was there to benefit from everybody else.
Mm-hmm. And so that ethos is kind of what carried into the founding of the Davenant Institute, right? Because the first convivium kind of comes out of the RI group. And so can you talk a little bit about the ethos that was kind of developed in the conversations that you had in RI, and kind of how that develops into kind of the ethos we try to develop at Davenant?
Yes. So the term Reformed Irenics actually wasn't coined then. It comes from, it described a group of Reformed theologians in the late 16th, early 17th centuries. And of course, well, I say of course, most people don't know this, but Irenicism comes from the Greek meaning peace, so they're seeking peace. So it's an era of increasing confessionalization in which the lines are hardening between Lutheran and Reformed first, and then between, Reformed and Anglican, as those identities are kind of growing in opposition to each other. And of course, Arminians, Calvinists, you have all these different battle lines that are then really hardening. And there's an effort on the part of a number of theologians to say, whoa, hold on here. Some of these issues are important, but some of these issues aren't so important. Some of these issues we're fighting over just because. And it's our goal should be reunion of all Protestants. Maybe that's going to take a while, but at least we should be working to distinguish what are primary doctrines from secondary doctrines and understand one another as well as possible, and cultivate, even where we can't agree, cultivate friendships across those divides. So David Pereus was a key representative of this movement. There were John Davenant was a key representative of this. The Forbeses in Scotland also were key Reformed Irenics. So we were trying to regain that ethos with the idea of really positioning ourselves theologically squarely at the intersection of the Reformed and Anglican traditions. So really trying to say, we need to get back behind that division, because once there was just English Reformed. And even although there have never been that many Lutherans involved in the project, I think there's been an openness to engagement with Lutheranism, and we have had a few Lutherans as well. So trying to bridge that divide, and having a lot of Reformed Baptists in the fold as well. So a kind of an interdenominational project and this is the key thing. Right? So it's different from late modern ecumenism, which functions by a kind of least common denominator thing, which says let's just sort of get vaguer and fuzzier in what we believe until we can finally come up with a formulation that's vague and fuzzy enough that everybody can sign on to it. And that's not the idea of Reformed Irenicism or what someone like John Davenant is doing, which is actually to use scholastic rigor and precision. If we can be very, very precise about what we mean, about what we're saying and what you're saying, sometimes we'll find that that precision cuts through an apparent disagreement and arrives at an agreement. A disagreement that was caused just by misunderstanding. Sometimes the precision it won't do that, but it'll at least show exactly where the disagreement is, and so we can then understand whether it's a disagreement over fundamental issues or over secondary issues or over tertiary issues, right? So scholastic rigor used in search of confessional reunion, and if not reunion, at least friendship and understanding, right? So that was the ethos, and certainly in the I guess you can call those the relatively early days of the internet at this point. The internet does not lend itself to Irenicism. The internet lends itself to grandstanding and name calling and all the rest. And so trying to create a space where we could a space that was a large enough space for a pretty robust conversation, but still a bounded space where, unlike Facebook, whatever, you didn't just have anybody wandering into the conversation, and so you could have, you could know who you were talking to, and you could treat them with respect. And sometimes things got fairly heated, and we did, it didn't always live up to its name, but in general, the ethos in terms of how we treated each other in the midst of disagreement and debate was something that was pretty unique from what you saw on the internet then and certainly now.
Mm-hmm. And in some sense, that conversation in RI really hasn't stopped, right? It's developed into what this thing we have now, the Davenant Institute. And it's it's over 10 years later now. What is it? 13 years since you've joined RI? Was it?
I think RI started in 2010. That's right. I guess I would have joined in 2011.
Right.
Davenant started in 2013 to provide a kind of institutional complement to that. And for the first, and RI continued as a sort of distinct thing. Was never run by Davenant.
Right.
It was, but it was sort of an informal conversation space for a lot of people who were involved in Davenant. Until I think 2017 or so, and maybe a little longer.
2017 is like the 70 AD of RI, right? You have Israel and the church, kind of over-existing, and then...
it was just as I said, it getting bigger and bigger, and then, overwhelming volume of conversation. Right. And so what tended to happen is it was losing some of the flavor because some of the older, more mature voices were, they were having kids at that point, and they were like, I can't engage as much, and so then you actually have the younger, less mature guys who are dominating the conversation. So it became tricky. But and we've never really found quite an adequate substitute for it. We tried since RI closed down, we tried at Davenant to create various discussion forum things, none of which have quite caught on as much, but we do have a Davenant, and they do suffer from the same dynamic, right? It's just that it's the people with the perhaps the least self-control who are the most online, and so the conversation can tend to get dominated by them. But we have the Davenant Common Room, which is the successor as it stands right now, and and you're going to be like the student moderator or something. We'll see.
Yeah, so it's been a long time. So now you've all these guys that were 10 years old or 12 years old or whatever when RI started, when you joined RI, that have now come up there. They've graduated college and they're coming to Davenant Hall. Right. And so now, if you don't know, Davenant Hall is the educational wing of the Davenant Institute. It offers an inlet in classical Protestantism. There's also a pastoral track, Presbyterian track, Baptist track, Anglican track. But now there's this new generation of Gen Z folk, and some not Gen Z folk, of course, have been pulled in into the Davenant circles, kind of maybe carrying on the torch of the next generation of Reformed Irenics. So the goal of this podcast is actually to talk to those people that are coming through Davenant Hall and to kind of carry on that discussion and the ethos found in the original Reformed Irenics. But one of the great things that we get a benefit from is there was no Davenant Institute when you were that age, right? And so you're kind of figuring these things out, and we get a benefit from great professors and leadership in Davenant Institute that have kind of been through it and done it. So we're going to have some professors from Davenant Hall on the podcast to talk about the classes they're teaching and kind of discuss how we're going to form the next generation of Reformed Irenics. So I don't know, Brad, could you talk a little bit about the type of student that you have formed in Davenant Hall and what we're seeking to produce?
Yeah. So I think the types that, as I think about like the core classes that we designed in the program that give a sense of the bases that we want everyone to cover. So we want folks who come through the program who are Protestants who really understand what the Reformation was about and why it needed to happen. I feel like for myself, I grew up in a Reformed Presbyterian church that taught the Westminster Catechism rigorously, and I learned all that stuff, but it was a sense, there was definitely a sense of these are the things we believe because these are the things we believe because we're Presbyterians, and so that's what we believe. And you could ask the sort of, well, but why? Like, why is justification by faith actually important? And you get kind of canned answer and like, well, the Catholics and works righteousness and religion and whatever, But there was never, it wasn't until I was a grad student really digging into Luther that I felt like I understood the gospel from within. And part of it too was, this might seem at first glance sort of distant from that, but the political theological context of Reformation is a piece that's missing from so many of our narratives, but is really, really crucial in understanding what was going on and what Luther was up to. And it's really, it's about, Luther's understanding of the gospel is about an understanding of the function of law and the function of justice, which is different. It's a theological dimension, not the political dimension per se, but of course it overlaps through the fact that the claims of the papacy were claims of the role of church law vis-a-vis the conscience, so impinging on the realm of justification, and vis-a-vis civil authorities, so impinging on the realm of what we would call politics proper. So that's a key thing that we try to actually understand at Davenant, in Davenant Hall courses. So I emphasize this in my Reformation, the Modern World class, is really getting a sense of how the political claims of the papacy tied in with what we would consider the more theological claims of the papacy, and how that really is part of what creates the need for the Reformation and the ongoing relevance of the Reformation. So we want Protestants who really understand what the Reformation was about. We want Protestants who are literate in the political theology of the Reformation and are willing to defend that as still meaningful and relevant today in a context where it's often just treated as, that was all just Christendom, and it was just, it was when the church was trying to run the state, and it's all irrelevant nowadays. Right? We also want students who really understand the Protestant natural law tradition, and what that means is, we are very. It's sort of designed to be our very first course. Most students aren't able to take it first in the sequence, but our residential intensive course, How to Read the Bible in the World, that really captures what we're about, is this idea that God reveals himself in both word and world, and we have to become proficient readers of those. There's a good hermeneutics. You have to learn good hermeneutics to be a good reader of the biblical text. You have to learn good natural hermeneutics to become a good reader of the structure of creation, and then those two have to be constantly cross-pollinating each other. You use your knowledge of the word to better interpret the world, and you use your knowledge of the world to better interpret the word. And that, I think, is so lacking in most Protestant theological formation today, and that's really, I think, one of the critical skills we want our students to have. And then the third, I'll just finish, is I can see you trying to cut me off. Is just back to that point about scholastic Irenicism, right? Is an ability to see across some of these confessional divides, but not in a woolly least common denominator way, but in a way that actually is willing to drill down deep into what these controversies are about.
Mm-hmm. So those three things, I think, resonate with me and why I wanted to do Davenant Hall in the first place. So the one, it's kind of defining Protestantism, not so, one, in its actual context of the continuation of Western Catholicism,
right,
rightly done. So it's defining Protestantism not just as, we're not Catholic,
right,
which was so much of the Protestantism I got growing up as well. We do this thing because that other thing is Catholic. We don't read written prayers because the Catholics do that.
Right.
Which I think is a very important ethos to have, that Protestantism is really just a continuation of Western Christianity. The
greatest offspring of the Catholic Church, as Philip Schaff called it.
The greatest offspring of the Catholic Church, yes, yeah. I like that. And the second one, one of the things that I've been thinking about recently as a fun phrase is, it seems like modern Christianity has too much grace and not enough nature. And I want to say, you can never have too much grace, right? Of course, we need as much grace. But the not enough nature aspect is something that you bring up of, because we reject natural law, and reject the necessity of having some philosophy when approaching scripture and having a hermeneutic like that. We so many of these things that are like core to Protestant identity, like our political theology, just like, well, that's just about how to order the natural realm. We can just kind of throw that out. But once you start throwing that out, you end up throwing out like the entire foundation of our tradition, how we do theology. So I don't know how you feel about that phrase, but it's a fun one I've been throwing around.
Yeah.
And the last point you made was kind of this, Irenicism, Irenics classicism. And I think that's important because I feel like so much of how precisionism is it's used to cause more division and cause more schism and more to define me against you, whereas using the scholastic method rather to come closer together, it's just a completely different way to use that tool, right? Because I think most people hear, oh, this, those folks, they're being really precise in their theology, and that just causes division. And theology is so divisive. But I think the point you're making is that actually, by being really good theologians that understand the distinctions, that understand how to do theology, that's actually a vehicle for us to actually come closer together, move toward each other. Right. Which I think is an important aspect of what you brought up with the kind of the DNA that made up the original RI and Davenant Institute, is it's this continual move towards one another in friendship, rather than trying to stay in our silos. You go do the Presbyterian thing over there, I'm going to do the Anglican thing over there, and I'm going to do the Lutheran thing over here, and kind of reveling in the fracturedness of our Protestant world that we now live in. But we want to say, no, let's not do that. Let's form students that are moving towards each other regardless of their traditions. Mm-hmm. And I'd say personally, in my own experience, that's been really helpful. I've struggled with moving towards Baptists, because that's the background I come from. So, I remember coming to my first convivium 2 years ago, and I was like, oh my gosh, there's so many Baptists here. Why are Baptists interested in classical Protestantism? Reformed Baptists don't, But I had a great conversation with our friend Dale Stenberg, who is a fellow of Davenant. He's a fellow, right?
Yes.
He's a fellow. Yeah. I was hanging out with him at ETS this last week. I had a conversation with him there where, talking to this guy, I'm so confused why all these Baptists are here. But then meeting this person and moving together and actually having a conversation, I realized, I actually want to move towards this person. This person expresses themselves with, love and trying to move towards me. And why would I want to try to move towards them? Mm-hmm. And that kind of defines the ethos, and it brings people from all over the place kind of together. I think about, the vice president of Davenant, Colin. He's from a very, very different ecclesiological context than you and I both come from. Just as excited about reviving classical Protestantism. And so, the idea of drawing closer to somebody theologically that comes from a kind of more Californian megachurch world, I just never would have occurred to me until I've gotten involved with the Davenant Institute, and it's actually formed myself to want to move towards other people. So that's kind of the ethos that we want to continue here in New Reformed Irenics. But as we wrap up, I'm going to ask you, Brad, the question I want to ask every single guest of the show. Just kind of wrap us up. So you recently wrote a book on why Protestants convert, which you can... That's out now, yes. It's January.
Pre-orders now. It's sometime next 2 or 3 weeks.
Okay.
Least, yeah. So
when you're listening to this in January, it should be out. So you can go on the Davenant. So I'll link it in the description of the show. But why Protestantism? Why be a Protestant in our current context? Why stay a Protestant?
Well, I ultimately think that the best thing about Protestantism is that it keeps the main thing as the main thing, right? It keeps the gospel at the center. And this is really the original genius of the Reformers' Two Kingdoms doctrine, which is so often misunderstood. And I think this is why kind of modern versions of Two Kingdoms doctrine that tie it together, which is not exclusively modern, I'll just say that, but that tie it together with a Iure Divino approach to polity, I think really betray the essence of what the Reformers were getting at, where the Reformers were saying, no, the realm of polity, the realm of church polity and the realm of civil polity is a realm largely of adiaphora, largely a realm of of secondary matters that are adaptable depending on particular circumstances and cultural contexts. And so what that enabled them to do was really keep the focus on the heart of the gospel and say, look, as for a lot of the rest of this stuff, it's important. Don't think it's not important in any way. And I think that is the danger of modern Protestantism has been to sometimes sort of keep the gospel and lose everything else that matters, all liturgy, all structure, all discipline. And I think if you do that, you're going to have a very impoverished faith. But I think at least you have the gospel at the center that you can hold on to, and then you can kind of build out you sort of rebuild those other things. Whereas I think Roman Catholicism has always had a tendency to crowd out the gospel with all of these other add-ons that seem to have equal status. And I think many Americans don't necessarily see that because most American Catholics are very Protestantized, right? But you go into the rest of the world, and you've got you've got actual syncretism, right? I mean, the worship of saints really does resemble a kind of polytheism, and the Roman Catholic Church has kind of turned a blind eye to that, even though if their official teaching says, well, no, this is not what we mean by praying to saints, et cetera, right? And at the time of the Reformation, you had the gospel had been crowded out by all of these other rituals and ceremonies, and these claims the church made for the church as a structure that were unchangeable, infallible. Right? And so what that meant was, I think one of the valuable things about that Protestantism's focus on the gospel and that original two kingdoms doctrine is both, as I say, it safeguards the purity of the gospel, but also what it does is it enables a healthy flexibility on those secondary things and enables the church to adapt and respond in a way that the Roman Catholic Church has never really known how to do. And so what you had is really up to the Second Vatican Council, the Roman Catholic Church didn't know how to budge on any of these matters of discipline and polity and liturgy that it had sort of put on an equal footing with the gospel. And so it sort of just tries to bury its head in the sand and ignore the modern world, whereas Protestantism is actually much more able to engage with and respond to and be an active shaper of the modern world. And then Roman Catholicism, when it sort of finally says, oh, great, we've got to update things, then it's sort of, everything is on the table, potentially up for changing. I think that's what we're seeing with the papacy of St. Francis. Not St. Francis. Pope Francis.
Hope not.
Yes, with Pope Francis, now that the Catholic Church has said, okay, you know what, we do need to be willing to update things for modernity. There's no criterion of where that updating stops. Whereas I think with Protestantism, you have a pretty clear set of criteria about this is doctrine that is not changeable. These are matters of discipline and polity that are changeable. And I think that means that evangelical Protestants who can recover their reformational roots are in a much stronger position for responding to the challenges of the 21st century than the Roman Catholic Church is.
That's a great answer. Well, Brad, thank you so much for coming on the first episode of the New Reformed Irenics podcast. And I'll be seeing you later. And thank you all so much for listening. Make sure to share this with a friend. Don't forget to go down to the description below where we're going to have a link to Why Protestants Convert by Brad Littlejohn and
Chris
Castaldo, yeah. He's great. He did a great fellows lecture on the Italian Reformation, so go check out sometime. But with that, we'll see you all next time.